So welcome everyone. My name is Roland Bleiker. I'd like to welcome you for this visual politics event on behalf of my co-host, Cormac Opdebeeck-Wilson.
Hello.
Now we have with us today Dr. T.J. Thomson from QUT to talk about his wonderful new book, To See and Be Seen: The Environments, Interactions, and Identities Behind News Images. It's an absolutely wonderful book. Cormac and I had the pleasure to read it in the last few days thoroughly in preparation for the interview, and it's a book that's extremely enjoyable and extremely insightful. It sort of looks at how images are made behind visual journalistic sort of practices and looks at the kind of everyday people behind the news, the people that we often sort of neglect and don't see. But I will pass on to Cormac now to introduce TJ before we start.
So it's my pleasure to introduce TJ, who's a senior lecturer in visual communication and media at Queensland University of Technology. He's also a chief investigator at the QUT Digital Media Research Center and on several ARC projects. TJ's research focuses on visual journalism, how it's produced, by whom, in what environments, through which processes, and with what results. This is also the subject of the book that we discussed today. And before entering academia, he worked as a freelance visual journalist for a number of news outlets, including the Associated Press, the Washington Post, and the Huffington Post.
Now, let's start off with a bit of background, perhaps. TJ, before you sort of embarked on your successful academic career, you spent quite a bit of time as a practicing visual journalist. And so I was wondering if you can tell us perhaps a little bit about this background as a visual journalist and how this background shaped the kind of ideas that were behind this book, for us to get a bit of a sense of where the book comes from, how it emerges, how it sort of fits into your work.
With pleasure, Roland. Thank you both for that kind introduction before I start off. I'm just continually impressed and amazed by your ability to do these events, even during a pandemic, during lockdowns, with all your other responsibilities. So thank you for bringing together scholars to chat about these issues and topics. It's wonderful. Thank you for having me. So background, I started freelancing about a decade ago in the States where I'm from originally. And in that experience, I was continually really amazed and surprised on an ongoing basis by the diverse reactions I would get to me and to my camera being in settings when I was covering the visual news. And so some people, even in public, they'd be very, very surprised, and they'd say, you have to get my permission to document me. And they thought my camera and myself were a bit of an intrusion on their privacy, even in public spaces. And there was just a wide range and gamut of reactions. Some people were a bit camera shy, and they wanted to try to recede into the background as much as possible. And other people were a bit more theatrical, and they're kind of playing up for the camera and trying to gesture and do all sorts of things they normally wouldn't do because I was there with my camera. So I was really kind of struck by how people were reacting to me and to my camera. And that was something that stuck with me. Another thing that stuck with me from my time as a visual journalist was being surprised by the image, and it was usually just one image that my editor would choose to represent the event. And the reason why it was just one image was I got paid by the image. So it was cheaper for them just to have one image represent the whole event. But I would have dozens or hundreds of outtakes from different hours and different angles and all these different aspects of the event, different people and interactions. And then it all boiled down to just being at the end, just one image usually that got put on the front page and that got represented as being the signature image of the event. And so those two experiences, having folks react to me in positive and negative and ambivalent ways, and then being surprised with what image was chosen to represent the event, really informed my kind of later research interests. So I started doing a master's degree at the Missouri School of Journalism, which is, fun bit of trivia, the place where the term photojournalism was coined in the 1940s. And when I was doing my master's work at Mizzou, I was looking at interviewing news photographers about their perceptions of the various variables and factors and elements that shape news images. And then I stayed on to do a PhD, and I tried to look at the kind of converse and flip side of that question. I was out in the field doing observational research, looking at, in the field, how do camera-wielding journalists and those who are depicted interact? Is there a conversation? Is there any dialogue, or is it just kind of very distant and detached? So I was looking at those interactions in the field, and then instead of interviewing journalists this time, I was interviewing the people who were represented, the ordinary folks who found themselves in front of a journalist's lens. And so that's a little bit about how my background has informed the evolution of this book, To See and Be Seen, and my quest to try to better understand how images are made.
So you talk about your focus on ordinary folk, right? And this is something that I personally not come across a lot in my sort of cursory reading of news coverage of protests in my case. Why are these stories so, important, and how do you go about covering them?
Great
Because
question.
you can, with photojournalists, you can figure out ways to get in contact with them and so on. But how do you find ordinary people at events to talk to?
Brilliant question, yes. So it is true that we tend to focus, I guess, most on elites, on people who are, professionals. They have offices, they have contact information. It's easier to reach them and to study the images they produce. It's a bit harder to look at more kind of ordinary folks who don't have, a directory listing or a biography on a website, that kind of thing. So to answer your question about how I got access to these participants in particular, I was really kind of lucky to have access to the behind the scenes infrastructure of the news outlet. And so I could look and see at their scheduling platform when they're going to have journalists and what locations. And so I could be anticipating when they'll be where and go out and observe them before they got there themselves. And then in terms of the other question about why is it important to study these stories behind everyday images, if we look at the stories we do know about news images, I think a lot of them are about more kind of iconic images. So for example, Dorothea Lange's Migrant Mother, or Tim McCurry's image of Sharbat Gula, Afghan Girl, or those kind of images, Joe Rosenthal's Raising the Flag in Iwo Jima. And these stories that we come to learn and know and appreciate only are told to us years, decades even after the interaction happens. And there's a bit of a commercial incentive. People want to be able to try to milk the story in some ways and get publicity and get more interest in the story so they can sell that image and market it more. But also, I think there's just perhaps some idle curiosity about why images are made and stories behind, who is Sharbat Gula, what was her story, how did she become to be in front of Stephen McCurry's lens, that kind of thing. So with my work, I hope it's not just indulging idle curiosity. I hope there is a bit more substantive rationale for why I'm doing what I'm doing. I guess if I had to tie it to that larger rationale, I would say that we have a fair trust deficit in a lot of contexts across the world, and that people, for whatever reason, have a lot of ideas about what news is, what journalism is, about who makes the news, about how the news is made. And so for better or worse, there are so many different opinions and perspectives on that. I think oftentimes a lot of time that isn't informed by direct experience. They haven't actually, chatted with the journalists themselves or interacted with the journalist, been in front of a lens of a journalist themselves. They've perhaps seen it play out on a screen in popular media, or perhaps they've just seen something on social media and they're calling that journalism, and it might not actually be journalism. So I think it's important that we delve in and dig a little bit deeper into how we make news images to try to equip and accelerate and elevate our media literacy so that we're hopefully not just kind of disengaged, cynical people participating in the democratic system, but hopefully we are a little bit more engaged, a little bit more thoughtful about how we can dialogue in the system and hopefully make a positive change.
Yeah, I think this is a fascinating sort of series of issues you bring up here around the trust deficit, how a lot of, everyday people, we look at the news and to what extent do we trust what we see, and what role do everyday people play in kind of, in some sense, closing this trust deficit. I was wondering to pursue this perhaps a little bit further. One of the nice things in your book is you actually start off going back in time, and you sort of, you tell the story about how visual journalism appeared, how visuals appeared, visual journals appeared, what kind of the background to it all. So I was wondering if you can take that a little bit further and look at how, one of the big factors at the moment, of course, is the landscape of visual journalism and of visuality in general is shifting dramatically, in terms of its digital means. Everyday people now have the ability to take photographs, to circulate photographs to social media. So in that sense, the role of everyday people behind the news is changing quite a lot in the sense that they're not always just behind the news. They can actually come to the forefront. So can you perhaps talk a little bit about how that fits into your work, the shift from behind the news to the front of news, and how that affects what you call the trust deficit?
With pleasure, Roland. Sure, yes. I think we can probably observe at least 3 shifts about how the democratization of production and distribution technologies is affecting how we make and share images. One of the first shifts I'd say is that it is changing the notion of witnessing, I'd say. So I think historically, if we look back about the role of a journalist and kind of being the person who creates the definitive account of an issue, you know, if it was a car accident or a protest or what have you, you'd have, you know, these singular images by a professional person, and those would come to represent that event, that scene, that setting. I think nowadays, since we do have so many more cameras and much more access to make images and share images, you have citizen journalism happening, you have police officers with body cameras, you have lots of more images and lots more vision happening. And I think that changes the notion of witnessing and what it means to be a witness in a journalistic context, perhaps. I think a second shift we might observe is related to the nature of experience, perhaps. I think, you know, if you have a celebrity or a politician or someone of high status and import in your local community, and you have an opportunity to interact with them, you have people who are kind of turning their backs to those politicians or celebrities so they can get themselves in the frame with a selfie. Or you have people observing festivals or concerts or speeches, not just live, but looking at these events through screens, through mediated realities. And so I think perhaps our screens and our cameras are changing the nature of experience in some ways. And then perhaps a third shift I can offer is, it might be that democratizing image production and circulation is contributing to the erosion of this idea of a singular idealized self in some ways. And I think that might be a little bit more obvious and a bit more apparent now, but I think historically we've tried to, or we've historically viewed the self as this kind of singular solitary entity. And certainly, you know, 100 plus years ago, if you wanted to get a depiction of yourself, you might have to pay a lot of money to get someone to paint a picture of you, a portrait of you. And there'd be a lot of money and time involved in the rendering of that portrait. And you'd have to be very careful and strategic with how you wanted to look in that portrait because of the great amount of time and cost that goes into that depiction. Whereas now, when you have a lot more access and it doesn't really cost a lot to take a photo, you can show more sides of yourself. You can show different aspects of your personality. And so in chapter 4 of the book, there's a bit of a case study I use, profile pictures across platforms, where folks are using different images to represent themselves as their profile picture across different platforms. And I was really surprised in that data set by the number of images, specifically as profile pictures, that are unflattering in conventional terms. Images of people with their eyes closed, or, you know, eating something mid-bite, things that you normally wouldn't have as being kind of the digital format of your social media presence. And so I guess in summary, those 3 things changed a notion of witnessing, altered nature of experience, and perhaps eroded the idea of a singular self that's been accomplished through the democratization of production and distribution.
You raised some great points. And in relation to sort of the expectations that people have when they're being photographed by journalists, right? Have you sort of seen in your empirical studies of that sort of new emerging attitudes? So, like, is there a clash between how people now, due to the emergence of all these technologies and so on, these new practices, a clash between these emerging values and, say, traditional photojournalism values? So, like, between the practice of photojournalism and the expectations of people who are being photographed?
I would say yes, absolutely. I think one of the classical understandings of photojournalism is kind of being the fly on the wall, of being kind of just existing in the background and the periphery, not really engaging or interacting or having a dialogue with the people, just a lot of distance between person depicted and person with the camera. And I think from what I've heard from the people I've interviewed, that perhaps is shifting, in that they want to have a bit of dialogue and a bit of interaction with the person who's covering them. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that they want to have, you know, a half-hour, hour-long conversation. I think oftentimes people are going to these events, a speech, a concert, whatever it is, not to chat with the journalist or to be distracted by the journalist, but to have the experience of being an audience member in that speech or that festival, that kind of thing. I think an expectation that I saw was that people want to have that dialogue or interaction, but they don't necessarily want the journalists to be distracting. And so there is a bit of tension there with not necessarily taking up too much space or being too visible with moving around and changing lenses and being noisy and that kind of thing. But also hopefully having at least a quick dialogue, quick, hello, who are you? What's your name? Who are you working for? What's the angle of the story? That kind of thing. I think there is a little bit of a shift there.
So do you think that is, just to tie it back to the distrust in the media, I'm remembering a quote from somewhere in your book where you interviewed someone who said that they wanted to find out where the journalist was from, who they were, taking photos for. Do you think that's got to do with, oh, I don't want to be covered by, say, Fox News, or I don't want to be covered by the Huffington Post or something like that?
It could be, and in some ways, I wish it would be. I think if folks are trying to be a little bit more critical about understanding, not just the media, but understanding journalism in all of its very nuanced and varied forms, from the local level to the regional level to the national level, from local on the ground coverage versus wire service coverage, versus freelance coverage versus professional staffer coverage. If folks are being a little bit more aware of underpinning ideologies of different outlets and organizations, I think that's a good thing. And if they can have that conversation with themselves or with others and say critically, what is this outlet? What does the outlet stand for? What are its values? I think that's a good thing to be kind of reflexive about.
Can I sort of maybe, after zooming in, zoom out a little bit, in the sense that one of the things that we found quite interesting in our visual politics program is that we bring together people from different disciplines to look at visual politics. So our next event is with Shirin Rai, who looks at the performative dimensions of politics and collaborates with people in theater studies. Then we have Sue Best, an art historian from Griffiths. And of course, you in communication studies. So I want to sort of put my hat on as a politics scholar and ask you, in some sense, coming back to the politics of representation, to how sort of visual journalists represent the world, what would you sort of say is that the key takeaway from your book in terms of what it means in terms of the politics of representation? What can we sort of really learn about the aspects behind the news for the larger politics of representation?
That's a big question, Roland.
Yeah, sorry, that's kind of like gives you permission to run in whichever direction you want.
It's media, I like it, it's good. Very good question. I'd say, if we think about what forces contribute to the politics of representation, without being flippant, I might say that everyone and everything can potentially contribute to the politics of representation, which is really, I think, expansive and perhaps too broad in some ways. But I can unpack that in a bit more fine-grained detail, if you like. I think we have to acknowledge, first off, that how we learn about things is important to our understanding of the politics of representation. And I'm not speaking just at this point of formal learning, formal education, university studies, that kind of thing. I think as people who are in a particular culture or society, we learn from a very young age, quite informally, about the values, the cultural practices of a certain society, a certain culture. And that can, from a young age, inform our expectations of what is journalism, what is representation, that kind of thing. I think, so that's a very, very kind of macro level kind of starting point, that all of us as part of a culture and society have a little bit of a embodied sense of what our values are for that culture. Are we more collectivistic, caring about groups and peoples? Are we more individualistic, caring about individuals and the effects on them, that kind of thing? Certainly, in our context of news images, the person with the camera and the person being depicted both have integral roles in that process. And I think both have agency and control. I think that the agency and control is different. When you're posting a selfie on social media, you have more control because you have the camera. And when you're in a journalistic context, you've lost that control. So the agency and the context is a little bit different there. But certainly the camera-wielding journalist and the folks depicted both have roles in that process. I think also the folks who work with the different outtakes and images to get them through the production process, the editors, the page designers, the people who are packaging and presenting the news or amplifying the news on social media platforms, and then going back to society again, the people who are building engineering platforms, the people who are using platforms to see these images, to comment on these images, to share these images and reshare these images, and then potentially also to remediate these images in different contexts and different meaning-making practices? So I think there's a lot of answers to that question, a lot of ways to think about that question. But I think it starts as being folks who are part of society and includes journalists and folks who are depicted, and then continues on to audience members as well.
Good. Look, I think we might have time for one final question. Do you have anything, Cormac, you want to sort of ask TJ before we pass on to everyone else here who joined us today?
Yeah, just really briefly. So you end your book, the last chapter, with sort of prescriptive claims and sort of recommendations for professional journalists and so on. And you use an interesting analogy. So you talk about the metaphor of visual journalism as corrective, and you use the analogy of the use of syringes within a medical context. Could you expand on that a little?
Sure, yes. So obviously COVID wasn't a thing back in 2018-19 when I was writing this book. But I thought that journalism and medicine have a fair bit in common. Both of them fundamentally exist in an ideal sense to make the world a better place. So medicine tries to do that through looking after our bodies and our minds, and journalism tries to improve the health of a society, a democracy, a community. And so they both have that kind of underpinning fundamental obligation, responsibility to improve the health of their relative respective systems, whether it's the body or the society. I think also awareness is really important and integral to both medicine and to journalism. So if you're even just a person, a patient, self-checks can be important for awareness about knowing what's going on with your body and if something's wrong with your body, but also can formal checks with a GP to see if things are going all right with your body. In the same way, as journalists and the institution of journalism should be doing checks on society, on individuals, on powerful folks to see how we're doing as a society. Are we healthy as a society? Are there things we could do to be more equitable, more representative, more thoughtful with our distribution of resources and wealth, that kind of thing. So both have that fundamental responsibility to improve health. Both have a focus on awareness. And then you mentioned syringes, Cormac. People react differently and in lots of different ways to syringes, to the idea of COVID checks and jabs and that kind of thing. And that is really contextual. Sometimes if you get a nurse or a GP or a pharmacist who interacts with you well and you have that nice rapport, they can be quite gentle, and it can be quite a simple process getting a COVID swab or getting the shot, the jab. But if you're a little bit nervous or you don't have that rapport, you can tense up, you can be nervous, and that can make that experience really unpleasant and painful. And I think there can be an analogy also with cameras. And as I look back to my own professional background, people would react differently to me, in some cases just because it was me and a camera, but in some cases also because of how I interacted with them. And so that interactional dynamic between patient and medical practitioner, or between journalist and subject, participant, I think is also a rich area of exploration. I think also the thing that we have in the syringes, the medicine, it's trying to make us better, trying to make society better, that medicine, that vaccine, in the same way that journalism hopefully is making society better in some way. I think where the metaphor might end or lose its utility, though, is that hopefully now we've come to realize and appreciate and understand the importance of medicine and of evidence and of data-based science, that kind of thing. But I can't say that the same thing is necessarily true for the institution of journalism. And I think just looking at the raw numbers of number of medical practitioners in the country of Australia, I think 500,000 or something medical practitioners we have here in Australia compared to about 5,000 journalists. So there's a really massive disparity just in raw numbers between numbers of GPs and pharmacists and medical practitioners and journalists. And I hope that people have the same kind of investment in the health of their bodies and their minds as they do in the health of their social systems.
That's a wonderful way to kind of wrap it up, perhaps, in the sense that, that's what we try to do with our seminars, is to kind of increase the mental health of everyone and to increase their knowledge and their communication and our sort of sense of an intellectual community, so to speak. So look, I just want to say before we pass on to everyone for comments and questions, a big thank to TJ for joining us on behalf of Cormac and myself. absolutely wonderful. Congratulations to his brilliant book. I would strongly recommend it. We have it in the UQ library in real and in an e-format as well. So thank you so much for joining us today, TJ.
Thank you, Roland.
Thanks
Thank you, Cormac. It's been great to be here. Thank you so much.